by introducing you to your next speaker, if I may. And if I could ask Mark to join us on screen. Mark, hi Mark, how are you? Good to see you. Mark, some of you may already be familiar with. He's a recognized author, consultant, and coach. Mark's been active in the process management and architecture space for nearly 30 years and doesn't look a day over 25, so it's hard to believe that, but very true. Mark spent several years as an analyst at Gartner and has worked for many of the significant vendors in the process market. He has written a number of books on process management, including People-Centric Process Management. Something of a tools guru, Mark has what some of his former colleagues at Gartner suggest is unrivaled insights into the types, use, and nature of tooling. And today he's turning his attention to process automation and its place in the broader process management landscape. So with that, I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of Mark and hand over the presentation. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Brian, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. So for some of you looking at your calendar invites, you might be thinking, well, this wasn't quite the speaker that we had in mind. I confess, today I'm playing the part of a late substitute, but hopefully a substitute that will still deliver some value for those of you looking to get a better handle around the use and application of RPA. In true style, for those of you that know me, then I'm going to be coming at it from a somewhat sideways perspective from some of the things that you might have in mind or you might hear from some of the other speakers. And that starts right off the bat with the topic that I thought of this morning when Brian reached out and thought, well, hang on a minute, we're talking about RPA and intelligent automation, but we're so quick to jump on the automation bandwagon. Actually, we're not necessarily questioning whether the process is just an automate. Is it a change a bit and automate? Or do we need to just obliterate the process and not bother doing any of those things? So let me just get the slides working. Okay, so the angle that I like to come at to start us off with is to remind ourselves that it's all about the customer. So often when we think about automation, we think about what we can do and how we can push things around, and how much of the automation that some of you have looked at is actually pushing work from yourselves to the customer. It looks good, right? We've driven down costs and hey, we're doing all the great things, but keep pushing the work onto me as a customer, and I may decide to simply fire you and go and spend my money somewhere else. Here we've got examples of some companies that were great no longer exist, but of course even some of those that are existing. So we'll look at the Asda's, the Tesco's, and the Sainsbury's in retail in the UK. They're under tremendous pressure. The business model has changed and they've been pretty slow to adapt. And who knows whether in the longer term they will stay around and succeed, or whether they will fall into the history of those customers or companies that just didn't actually think about obliterating their processes and their business model and coming up with something new. They simply focused on how do we do what we already do, but in a different way. So that's one thing I want you to think about when you're looking at that automation silver bullet. Is it just going to simply slow down your demise, or is it actually going to make a big difference and are you going to become the disruptor? The other lens that I wanted us to have in mind before we even look at some of the technology pieces is the customer experience versus operational excellence. I mean, today we're all talking about RPA, intelligent automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc., etc. We've got buzzwords coming out of our ears like never before. But the automation piece is not new. We've been looking at automation since the very days we started in computing. The challenge we have now is that a lot of the focus is either we have people focusing on their back end, so they're creating this wonderful smart car, from an operational excellence perspective, yet it's still actually pulled by a horse from the customer's point of view. Or we get those that say, hey, you know, I'm going to create this wonderful new mobile automation experience. The customers are going to love it. And when we look inside our organizations, it still feels like we're pulling a wooden caravan. We just got this complete disconnect between what people think of as customer experiences and what they think about as operational excellence. And somehow, when we're looking at the rounded areas of where and how best to apply automation, we've got to start bringing these worlds together so we can actually pull the modern caravan with a modern car. And if you don't believe me that the disconnects between that customer experience technology approach with the back end makes sense, then here's a story that I plucked out from some press last year, where Home Depot planned to spend $300 million on wonderful new digital technologies. We're going to enable call and collect services for customers. It's going to be fantastic. Yet within 6 months, their CEO had to go back to the board to get an extra $1.2 billion because they hadn't thought about what it was going to entail to build the new distribution centers and totally overhaul the order fulfillment process. So I was looking at one piece without looking at the second piece. And I worry that for many of you, you may make the same mistakes with RPA. It reads quick and easy and cheap to fix, and let's get something in there and get something happening we can worry about tomorrow. Except that you never worry about tomorrow. You never get to go back. And when you do get to go back, the problem suddenly becomes much bigger than you thought. So before we start automating, we need to think about the processes and the way we think about processes. So here's some stuff, and I didn't mention it in the introduction, and nor did Brian. So I work with a number of different vendors. So Abby's one of the vendors that I work with, and I work with some others. But here I borrowed some stuff from them from a state of the process mining and robotic process automation report they had, where 39% of companies think that they've got rigorously adhered to processes, and yet 51% of people suggest they deviate from those predefined processes to meet customers' needs. So think about that for a moment. Firstly, it suggests that only 61% think they've got rigorous processes that people are actually going to be able to automate. Because if we don't have the rigor, then we can't go applying RPA. It's going to be, as it says, robotic. It's going to do the same thing over and over again. But if people are having to deviate to meet customer needs, now we've got a problem, because the robot doesn't care about customer needs, right? The robot's simply going to do the same thing over and over. So we've got a bit of a challenge there in terms of, well, even if we're going to apply RPA, we need consistency in doing that. And process mining is one of the technologies, and we're going to talk about some of the other technologies that we can use, because we need a smarter way of doing it. Because one of the things that Forrester found from a survey last year was that 50% of people suggest they didn't have sufficient end-to-end visibility across the flows to actually manage and monitor what robots were doing. So they didn't know when robots were doing the wrong things. So we've got to have something in place. So let's look at that technology landscape and say, okay, we know that we need to do RPA, but what are the other technologies that we might want or need to put in place? So playing the buzzword game, frequently, and indeed I'm sure we're going to have plenty of other speakers talking about these topics in the sessions today. We're going to hear people talking about connecting process mining with RPA. We're going to talk about task mining with RPA. Some will talk about putting process intelligence with RPA. But not very often will they talk about the process discovery, which may or may not be as simple as using the process mining and task mining. It may be beyond that. Rarely will people talk about modeling the different scenarios. Rarely will they talk about saying, well, actually, we're going to capture this task, whether that's with the task mining that comes as part of the RPA tool, or whether that's task mining separate from the RPA tool, doesn't really matter. Most people doing task mining are literally saying, I want a robot that's going to help person X do Y. Now I'm going to go and find the best person for doing that. I'm going to record them. There we go. We've set it up. We've programmed the robot. Away we go. We roll it out. But the trouble is that may not be the same way that other people do it. We think it is, but we don't know. So are you collecting enough insights from enough different users and bringing those together and running a detailed analysis to work out, is there a common way of doing it? Because it may well be that there isn't a common way of doing it, or not sufficiently common that it doesn't actually make a good candidate for RPA. Other aspects to it, of course, if we start modeling the full process, we might find, and many of you may have already found this, that actually you've taken on board RPA but forgotten all of the learnings of Lean, and you've simply moved the bottleneck from one part of your process to another. So you think you've increased the productivity of one particular person, but actually they're one of many in a chain. And all you've simply done is move the queue from one place to the other. If you don't take the time and look at the overall process, then you won't know whether RPA is the right approach. And I think that's where, in my mind at least, the use of intelligent automation is an interesting concept, because the intelligence for me comes at a couple of different levels. The intelligence at one level from vendor speak is all about saying, well, it can learn these things and it can make decisions by itself. That's great. But really the intelligent automation is saying, we think as an organization, we can and need to benefit from automation, but we need to apply automation in a far more intelligent way to ensure that we optimize the whole. And this is an area where, excuse me, if we go beyond the process mining, task mining, and we look at more of the process intelligence type products, which have grown out of process and task mining, don't get me wrong, but they add greater degrees of analysis. They bring greater insights. In particular, process intelligence brings in monitoring. So if we're going to put in the robots, or indeed look to any other automation, we can actually start monitoring. So we can see whether we're having the expected improvements, the expected effects, or what the downtimes is. But better still, I wonder how many people are running simulations, because simulation can be an expensive thing to do, but it doesn't have to be. We can run much lower cost simulations and say, well, what would happen if we move this bottleneck from here to there? And many RPA projects that I've heard about, people wish they'd run simulation first, because what actually happened was they put in bots, they found that the problem moved and they weren't sure why they weren't getting the expected gains. And then when they ran the simulation, they realized that actually they'd either applied the bots in the wrong places, or actually providing half as many bots here and some other automation down here actually created the full flow. So we need tools that are going to enable us to analyze those processes. Remember, I said at the beginning, do I want to automate? Do I want to invigorate or obliterate? And it all starts with that process analysis. So whether we're capturing processes from systems with process mining, whether we're recording users interacting with systems through task mining, when we bring that data together, we've got some really rich insights that will enable us to actually look at the process overall. And particularly when we're thinking about it from that customer perspective, we may actually find that there is an awful lot of things that we could just stop doing. I mean, I haven't specifically called out on this particular slide the issue of business rules analysis, but often when working with organizations and doing very quick process analysis at a high level, we discover that actually it's old rules that are getting in the way. We thought we needed a new process. We thought we needed new automation, but actually what we realized was we just needed to remove legacy rules and legacy ways of working, and suddenly we can slim down the process and do more effective things. Now, one of the things that you will hear a lot for anyone that's talking to you about the use of these technologies in the vein of RPA and intelligent automation is about being data-driven. I'm not so sure. I can't speak for you guys, but I'm tired about being data-driven. I still believe that gut feel and intuition have a significant part to play in business. However, I do like the idea of being data-enabled. So where there is data that I can collect to either prove or disprove my hypothesis, then I'm really, really interested. However, I don't want to be making decisions purely about data, because the data tends to be looking in the past. We can look at some predictive stuff from the future, but even predicting the future is still based on the data of the past. So when markets change, when pandemics hit, when people suddenly find themselves working from home, when security becomes, oh, hang on a minute, how are we going to? Data driven is not going to actually impact that. However, I do want to collect the data on risks, etc. So be data enabled, I would suggest. So when I take those and I put them together in a slightly different way, and I bear in mind that I have in my head the fact that we don't want to use a robot or just a couple of robots. We actually want to scale and build for change. We want to be constantly changing. And that's one thing that we've learned over the last 12 months, is that change really is coming at us far faster and far harder than ever before. And I don't know what the next big change is going to be any more than most of other people on in this session. But I do know that it is going to be big, and we're going to have a lot more stuff to come. So rather than just focusing over here on the right on RPA as another operational system, or indeed the journeys, we actually need to make sure that you've got something in place in whatever tool set works for you that addresses your ability to map processes, to model processes, to mine them, to run that simulation, to be able to manage the process. Because if you don't have a management system separate from the robots, then you've got a problem, because robots don't tell you what's going on. They're just going to get on and do the same things over and over again. So you need that management and monitoring layer over the top of whatever it is you're going to use for automation, so that you can properly connect people, process, and systems so they're working in a seamless way to deliver the maximum benefit to your organization. And in this respect, I suggest that success comes with connections rather than replacing. So we get some vendors say, well, you don't need that modeling piece because I've got a little bit of modeling in my RPA solution, or I've given you enough mining in my RPA tool. Or you've got the modeling vendor that says, well, you can use whatever RPA vendor you want. No, actually, I want to know that I'm creating an ecosystem that can work and play together. And it's perhaps broader than the topic of RPA and intelligent automation today. And it applies to many, many markets. But I think a trend that I would urge many of you to keep looking at and monitoring and seeing what's going on and thinking about when you choose vendors in whatever markets you choose, is to think about the concept of ecosystems. I think we're moving faster and faster towards a world of loosely coupled ecosystem-centric tools rather than the vertical integrated, which is a pretty unusual thing for someone like myself to say, because I've spent a lot of my career taking disconnected or disparate tools within vendors and bringing them together in the suite scenario. So whether that's the likes of Mega, whether it's the likes of Popkin, or whether it's the likes of Signavio. But I think we're coming to the end of that as a general rule, with a couple of exceptions. I mean, I think that some of the technologies, principally around the task mining, process mining, I don't see a long-term future for those as a standalone market. I think that it will become a feature or capability that we expect in other vertical stacks. So think about how well these tools can plug together into an ecosystem play. Don't get overly bought in to a single vendor saying, yeah, well, we do that, because if I just take the task mining as an example, there are very few RPA vendors that have task mining that will deal with multiple tasks, long-running processes recorded against hundreds of different workers, all brought together for a more detailed analysis, because it's not what they do. They're really very focused on remote desktop recording, record a user, put in the bot, record the user, put in the bot. And there's a place for that desktop recording, and I think that, you know, I would call desktop automation. But I think as many of you on this session will have seen for yourselves, this is an area that's ripe for people like Microsoft with the work that they've been doing in this area, and we should expect the Googles and the such like to cover that personal productivity, which I think is the really big growth area here, is around personal productivity. So a couple of graphs that I've used now for many, many years. So let's take a look at, you know, our traditional organization. We're sitting there and basically we're just doing things. When we put in the RPA, often we're focusing on the efficiency axis, so we move into that doing things right. And that's good. I mean, that can be really, really useful. But that just means that we're doing the same thing but cheaper. It doesn't actually mean that we're going to be more successful in the long run. Now, interestingly enough, if we did less automation, but we focused more on doing the right things, with or without automation, in other words, being more effective, then actually we're likely to be more successful. We're going to be more successful principally because our staff are going to be happier because we're making things right for them, we're enabling them to serve customers, etc., etc. Now, of course, where we want to be doing is to make sure that we're doing the right things right and get up into that top right-hand corner. But I wonder how many RPA, IA initiatives are really focused on that doing the right things right, not just looking at efficiency, but actually questioning whether what we're doing is effective as well as being efficient. And another way of looking at that effectiveness, efficiency is, okay, so we want to get up there and thrive. You know, because if we're just chasing the efficiency, then we're going to die slowly. If we chase the effectiveness, even if we're not as efficient, we will survive. And by the way, the pop quiz, what's wrong with this picture? So this picture has, of course, the die quickly and die slowly transposed. The reason I use it, and I find it amusing to use, is I pulled this one off the web. It's a graphic that I created many, many years ago. And it's interesting to know when people borrow your work because they also borrow your mistakes. So I wrongly labeled these boxes in a graphic that I used about 10 years ago. And it's funny that everyone else that seems to have borrowed it seems to have copied it with the same mistake. So reducing pain drives efficiency, but it's effectiveness that's driving that great service. So I want you guys to be delivering great experiences to your customers, great experiences to your employees, and great experiences to your stakeholders, because I know that if you focus on doing those things, you're going to thrive. I'm not sure that survival is a good place to be, and there are a lot of people that have discovered over the last 12 months that survival was okay at a time of crisis, but to actually move on beyond that, we need to change. So I suggest that you think less about applying technologies for efficiency and more about for effectiveness. So whether we like it or not, however we're going to do it, we're going to wind up with our robots. But here's the thing. For any of you in large organizations, I wonder just how many robots you might actually be hiring. Because I don't think you're going to have all of your RPA and all your IA from a single vendor. You're going to have different parts in different departments, different divisions. And so you rush off and you decide that this is the vendor I want, and you go in and you tell them, good news, you're hired. Now, that's great. You've brought the robot on board. You've decided you're going to go for the effectiveness. You've got the robot on board. But where do you go next? Sorry, it's my fault. So yeah, where do you go next? Because if you think about it, I'm using a robotic workforce. Well, if it's my workforce, and we sometimes use the hire to retire scenario that says, well, actually, if I was recruiting, I need to identify what skills are required. So before I bring on my robots, I need to work out what skills do I want? Well, that's the process analysis and design, right? Which problems do I want to solve? So when we think about it as HR, I need to do that. But I also need to be thinking about employee performance. I run appraisals every year for my staff, or even more frequently. Well, what are you doing for robots? Did you have a performance assessment for robots? Did you work out what the equivalent was? If you don't have monitoring, how do you plan on moving these things through? So you need to have an appraisal system in place for your robots. So if you think about it, as an employee, you might be now running with 360-degree type feedback. So customers, partners, other process owners. Well, where's your 360-degree feedback for your robot? Because just because the IT guy says, hey, it's working exactly as we said, doesn't mean to say that it's actually helping the HR manager in the way that they wanted, or the partners or the customers. So keep asking the questions and keep changing it. And you have to put the systems in place because, of course, your robot is a pretty passive participant in your review process because they're really sure that they're going to be in the right place. Now, I know that one of the later talks is going to, from Blueprint Systems, is going to talk a little bit about replacing robots. Well, let's put that replacing in context for a moment. Every robot that you put in place today, in my opinion, is likely to be replaced within 18 months to 24 months. Technology is moving so fast. They're no different from, using your iPhone or whatever. They're moving on. The technology is moving on so rapidly. So what are you doing for retirement planning? How are you going to handle the retirement planning? When the robot goes away, how do you either skill up the new robot, the new kid on the block, you're losing your millennials and you're getting your Generation Ys on board? How do you transfer those skills? Which skills need to be transferred? Which work needs to be changed? So these are the types of questions that you need to have in mind. So even when you do decide to start adopting these new automation technologies, you need to know that you have the job description, that you have a performance system in place to measure against that, and that you have plans in place for when the robot becomes too old and it's time to send them off to the beach to go drink whatever it is that they're going to be drinking, 3-in-1 oil or whatever it is that gets them going. So think about those things and think about what it is that you need to have in place to make sure that you're in a good place. So moving on, it's something, any of you that know me know this is something I'm passionate about, really is, that change is a do with and not a do to process. So we spend too much time doing these things to people, putting, hey, I'm here from head office and we're here to help and I've got this new robot that's going to take over a chunk of your work. Well, hang on a minute, is that the chunk of work that I think is causing me a problem? What's going to happen when it takes over this chunk? What does it mean to me? How's it going to affect me? Why don't I just get you involved? How do you want to do it? And I think this is why the personal robot is possibly the way of the future. I'm a believer that we're going to move from corporate putting in bots for specific tasks to a world where what we may actually do is to say, hey, here's your bot. Here's how your bot can be programmed. And now away you go. And here's ways that we can help you program your robot to do what you need it to do to help improve the way that you work, to deliver what you need. And quite frankly, for many people in this COVID world, to actually get a life. I can't say how many of you on the call, but I wonder how many of you now are actually working more hours, never mind juggling the kids' schooling and everything else, but are actually working longer hours because someone says, well, you've got nothing else to do, so you may do some work, or, well, you've saved the commute time, so we'll just bring the commute time into your daily working time. It's an interesting concept. So when we do bring in those robots, assuming that we're doing it, then I go back to, there's no point in bringing in the robots or other automation from an implementation perspective. It's not going to be adopted, because creation without adoption is just a waste. Process automation needs to serve everyone's needs, apologies for the typo, not just the center of excellence. You know, how does it help me? Can I compare my performance personally with the rest of my team or other teams doing similar work? Is there a reason, you know, as the divisional manager, is there a reason for variance among geographies? Is it skill levels? Is it local working practices? Does the way that my people work compare with what I thought they were going to be doing? How do I get that comparison? And as I mentioned earlier, is there data to support or disprove my analysis or hypothesis? And then, as I've already mentioned, now, where do we focus on those continuous improvement efforts? Because one of the challenges I foresee in a world where we increasingly rely on bots is, how do we deal with 21st century continuous improvement? Because we are having to deal with greater continuous improvement. Process monitoring and process mining are giving us the ability to do more of that kind of analysis than we've ever had before, in ways that are less intrusive and do not involve quite so many people in quite so many meetings. They don't replace them, and looking at that smarter ways. So we have to put in an environment where we can still be reminding ourselves that we want to change, we want to be more effective, we want to be more efficient, and we want to keep changing as we need to. And one of the things that I'm finding interesting, and I just shared with you guys, and you may have seen it in other markets, is that I think that democratization is the fastest emerging differentiator in the world. So many of you will know that you know, I spent just over 3 years working with Gero and the management team at Signavio, and you will have seen the news recently of their acquisition by SAP. So well done and kudos to the guys there, great deal. You will also have seen that I've worked in the EA space with LeanIX. So those are companies that I've had direct experience with, but if we also look at other areas, look at places like Slack, look at things like Confluence, and what we start to see is that there's a trend of success where successful companies are focused on democratizing. So taking something that's away from a core group of people, so if you like the RPA COE, and saying actually it's not about the COE, it's about everybody else getting involved. How do we democratize it so everyone can get involved in improving their own work and their own way of doing it? Yes, you know, like an orchestra, we need to be conducting to make sure that the tune is being played correctly. But one of the things that you might want to start looking at when you look at some of the other technologies and you look at the way you apply them in your organization is the technology enabling and supporting democratization? Are you supporting democratization? Or are you still trying to keep a handle on things and risking going back and looking at, you know, history of the mainframe computing versus the PC scenario, where you risk being rolled over by others outside of your COE or outside of the IT group who are going to start doing these things for themselves? So you can either become the conductor of the orchestra and enabling all the musicians to play, or you can stay in that control at the center and find yourself being marginalized over time. So just something to think about. Now, you know, this is an image which, apologies if anyone finds disturbing in any way, but it's an image that really, for me, sums up what we should be looking at when we're looking at this automation. We need to be helping our people do things they can't already do. to enable them to either things that they can no longer do or things that we were never able to do. It's about enabling and supporting and helping people. This guy, I'm sure, is more than mildly appreciative of what robotic automation brings to him. But when you look at the way that so many companies are applying RPA and IA today, they're just doing the same things. You know, they're doing the wrong things faster and cheaper than ever before. So please think about how you can help people do things that they can't already do. That's going to increase your productivity. That's where your top line growth is going to come from. And for those of you that think, well, hang on a minute, you know, why does he keep going on about people? This is supposed to be more about RPA and automation, and he keeps going, people. Well, you know, you can ignore them at your peril. So here I take a quote from GuideSpark, you know, $1.3 trillion into transformation initiatives, where 70% was on wasted, on failed programs, $900 billion. And the biggest reason was they weren't effectively communicating the goals, strategy, purpose, outlook with their employees, and I would go on to say, and involving the employees at the lowest practical level in enabling and facilitating and leveraging that change. So when we go through with our RPA and our IA, then let's not make the same mistake that people did often with ERP, with early days of BPMS, even some workflow and other mainframe systems, because otherwise history is just going to keep repeating itself. Having said that, you know, we do need to be focused on the future. So this might seem a little counterintuitive. I've been talking about doing process mining, process analysis, and most of these things are of the future. And I believe that you do need to look at the past, but only in the context that it's relevant to the future. Because we can spend forever analyzing the past, but you need to design the future. And you don't need a current state model to create the future state model. But you do need a future state model if you wish to have a look at which parts of the current state are relevant or irrelevant, which parts need changing, and what the context of the change needs to be. So I've got a couple of parting thoughts to finish off with. So a question for you. So my question to you, a little bit rhetorical, obviously, because we're not together in a physical world, is what do you do when the robots go on strike? Now you may think, well, hang on, that's stupid. The robots don't go on strike. Well, hypothetically, they do. They either stop working because there's a software problem, they might stop working because the electricity's pulled out. Well, there are a couple of examples now, particularly in the financial sector, of organizations losing, let's just call it tens of millions, because the hundreds of millions or millions can be hard to get our heads around. Because when the robots stopped working for real, they couldn't bring in customer money because nobody knew how to transact it from a manual perspective. The job descriptions were not written down. The only people that knew how the robot did it was the robot, and it wasn't telling. So just be careful if you choose to ignore, put to one side my words of caution around having the job description and decoupling those job descriptions and those process maps and models from the robot itself. You too could be held to ransom by a non-working, non-functioning robot where staff no longer know how to do what the robot was doing. And for those in the UK or familiar, not so with the UK now, because obviously they're striking more and more international deals, I think Ocado must be one of the most amazing stories of applying robotic technology, right? You know, with their totally automated warehousing, and they're more of a technology company now than a grocery company. But as the image already flicked over to, a couple of years ago, when they had a great big fire, they lost, and I'm just having to look up here because I made some notes. They had a 10% drop in their share price the following morning. They subsequently reported after 2 fires that losses had grown from something like 100 million to 200 million. Yeah, they've done better now. And one of the problems was, going back to this image, when the fire started, nobody could smell the smoke. So when you put in your robotic solutions all around your business, please remember to ask yourself the question, when we've put in the automation and replaced people, who's going to smell the smoke? So I've got no idea what questions have been coming in. So hopefully some have, but I know that Brian's been chomping at the bit. I've got some other resources which I've taken from Abby. So if people want to reach out, if you're interested, there's a couple of really nice white papers around process intelligence for RPA. There's a really good impact of COVID survey that they did on employees relating COVID and automation together. So for anyone that's looking at how those things play together, then please feel free to reach out to me. But then the last one that I also highlight from that survey, actually, which is something that I don't think anyone else is touching on at the moment in the conference, is the connectivity between IDP, Intelligent Document Processing, and RPA. Because I know from talking to some of the guys that I work with at Abbey, it's not an area that I'm especially knowledgeable on, but actually content-driven processes is one of the biggest areas for automation. And indeed, many of the leading RPA vendors do work with Abbey for that IDP. So when you're looking at different areas, then content-driven processes is a really big and ripe area for the application of these types of technologies. So I'm going to just now stop sharing and invite Brian to come back and join us. And when he unmutes, he'll be even better. But it's good for him to do that, not me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I would rather suffer the embarrassment than yourself, Mark. But fantastic presentation as always, hugely insightful. And so with the few minutes we have remaining, let's jump straight into the questions. So Anna Martinez asks, also love the presentation, by the way. Could you provide more details on why process discovery is different from process mining? I suspect we could go on for this for quite some time, but could you give us a brief overview of why that is in your opinion?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's pretty nuanced. So process mining, process discovery, from the process mining vendor's perspective, they say it's one and the same thing. But remember, I'm old school, and I resent the process mining, process intelligence community telling me that I no longer need workshops and post-it notes and I can do it all with process mining. I actually can't. And I can shoot any of them down in flames. So there needs to be a mixture. So I separate the two. So some discovery can be done through process mining. That is true. But, that process may span multiple systems, which you may not realize until you start doing some manual work. So I tend to separate them out. So some of that analysis and discovery, I still think is better done through workshopping, through meetings, and other forms of, let's call it people interactions, because I can't say physical anymore because we can't do those at the moment, but one day we will. But whether we're whiteboarding, so I just draw them to be separate so that we don't just assume that just applying process mining is really discovering everything. And your video is freezing, Brian. We're not hearing also. Your video is freezing occasionally, Brian, and we're not hearing you if you're offering up another question.
Mark, apologies. I live in a small village, which is apparently providing me with somewhat chocolate box communication issues that I run into occasionally. So thank you for answering that one. Martin has a question. Again, excellent presentation and great insights. Could you give us some business case examples where AI was scaled right, and by right he means effectively doing the right things that you said? Are there any case studies out there which we can draw on as we move forward?
Yeah, there are some case studies. I apologize, Martin, I've got no one jumping into my head. Interestingly enough, so if I were researching it and said, gee, I wish I had the answer to Martin's question right at my fingertips, I need to go do some checking, I'll share with you, Martin, where I would go and search. So I would ignore, in my first mind, I would ignore searching the RPA vendor case studies, and I'd be looking at the case studies from the process mining or the process modeling type vendors and looking at their case studies, because they have nothing to gain from selling lots of bots. So if they can demonstrate how certain companies were more successful, I mean, I've certainly worked with a couple of telco and utility examples, but unfortunately, they don't want to be public in what it's done. But they've done it very, very effectively. But yeah, what I would say, Martin, is I would be looking at the modeling and mining vendor websites and looking for case studies from their websites where they have nothing to gain by promoting RPA because they don't have an RPA tool to sell you. I mean, you know, if I make one exception, I would say that from my experience, Blue Prism, I know work really well with a number of different vendors. So you know, I know they work with Abby, I know they work with Signavio. So they've probably got some pretty interesting stuff in terms of that ecosystem play to get a greater level of result.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And as a final one, it would seem that robots need to have a human backup really to support customers addressing the problems that robots can't really deal with. That seems to be something that you would broadly agree with. Are there any sort of nuances around that, or is that always going to be the case?
Well, think about it. I mean, the easiest way I always think for all of us to think about this is to look at the automation in contact centers and think how frustrating it is when press 1 to do this, press 2 to do this, so I want to speak to somebody. I don't have one of your standard queries. And of course, the contact center vendors, hey, it's much easier because now you just need to speak your query. We make it much easier for you. Okay, I want to close my account. I'm sorry, that's not one of the options. And it keeps going. And so now they've got so clever that they can get it to answer everything that they want to answer, nothing that we want to answer, and we can no longer just hit 0 to skip all of the menus and get to a human being. Actually, these days, how many of those contact centers have got so smart that when we hit the wrong button, they just say, I'm sorry, and hang up on us? It's like, well, what kind of service is that? So what I would say is, think about the way you're interacting with the suppliers you deal with and think, well, actually, are we just about to do the same thing, enforcing our workers through that robotic system, that actually we're forcing them to be human robots as opposed to having that flexibility? So yeah, got to be really, really careful and ask yourself the question. You know, the COVID survey I think was fascinating that Abby did, is that the level of interest amongst the workforce to have a robot help them is really, really high. But at the same time, those with robots say that the value they put on them is really, really low. So how do you get that mismatch? Well, the mismatch is somebody else decided what they thought the robot should do for you. Nobody actually asked you which is the bits that are causing you the most pain, which is the work you'd like to stop doing, which would you like to spend more time doing, and here's how you can enable the robot to do that way, because it may be that what someone thinks is frustrating, someone else loves doing.
Fantastic. Mark, once again, thank you for joining us at relatively short notice. A fantastic substitute. And we look forward to hearing more from you as the series develops. If anybody wants to catch up with Mark afterwards, please do let us know. And I'm sure you'll be able to link in with him as well. The next session starts promptly at midday. So I do look forward to having you join us, where we will be joined by Rohil Khan, the President of Digital Services and Solutions at the Institute of Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. I'm sure that's going to be another really dynamic session. So see you all at the top of the hour and look forward to catching up then. Take care. Bye-bye.